From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
In our release of these 400,000 documents about the Iraq War, the intimate detail of that war from the US perspective, we hope to correct some of that attack on the truth.
WikiLeaks releases over 390,000 classified U.S. documents on the Iraq War, the largest intelligence leak in U.S. history, and the largest internal account of any war on public record. The war logs provide a trove of new evidence on violence, torture, and suffering in Iraq since the 2003 invasion. We'll host a roundtable discussion with three journalists: David Lee, investigations editor at the London Guardian; Pratap Chatterjee of the Center for American Progress; and independent journalist Nia Rosen, just back from Iraq. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations chief investigator on torture is calling on the Obama administration to order a full investigation of the role of U.S. forces in human rights abuses in Iraq. Manfred Nowak's call comes after the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks released nearly 400,000 classified U.S. military documents that detail how U.S. forces did nothing to stop reports of abuse, torture, rape, and even murder by Iraqi police and soldiers. In addition, the WikiLeaks war logs show at least 15,000 more Iraqi civilians have died in Iraq than previously thought. In the streets of Baghdad, local residents say the leaked documents confirm what they've known for years.
I think there's no new information because all Iraqis witnessed the events following the invasion and those following the war. At least every family has a detainee who was tortured in prison, whether taken by Iraqi or foreign forces, or they know someone who was killed, either by Iraqi or foreign forces. This is something we all know about. We don't need documents to know this. The only thing is that these documents are official confirmation.
According to the war logs, a U.S. Apache helicopter killed 2 Iraqis in February of 2007, even though they were trying to surrender. The helicopter unit was the same that killed 12 people and wounded 2 children in a July 2007 attack captured on video and leaked by WikiLeaks earlier this year. An Army intelligence analyst, Bradley Manning, has been in prison since May when he was arrested on charges of leaking the classified material. The Obama administration's lashed out at WikiLeaks for the latest disclosures.
Julian Assange set up WikiLeaks in order to facilitate whistleblowers, to facilitate, publish, really, information that governments were wrongly withholding from their public and that was needed by the public, and he did so. I actually stood at his side in a press conference in 2010 when he revealed the so-called Iraq war logs. Thousands of pages we know now were supplied by Chelsea Manning about many illegalities, including torture, going right up to the then current administration, Barack Obama. So a number of governments, Britain, which was a very cooperative partner in this coalition of the willing in aggression against Iraq, it revealed crimes, actually. Not only in the, it wasn't high enough level in the decision-making to reveal how we got into Iraq, but what we were doing when we were there, which involved death squads, assassinations, and torture, widespread torture, was something that our government did not want known. It was clear revelation of war crimes. And so it was kept classified.
Well, first of all, obviously, let me thank all of you who are here. Thank you so much for coming. I want to first thank, of course, the National Lawyers Guild chapter here at UCLA Law School, because without them, we wouldn't be here. To properly introduce myself, for the record, because we are doing some filmings of this, I'm the Executive Director Emeritus of the National Lawyers Guild here in Los Angeles, a member of the governing board of the ACLU of Southern California, and the host of the Lawyers Guild show on Pacifica Radio KPFK. My hope is I can tell you is that by the end of our presentations today, that you're all going to agree, and I suspect you already do, that the persecution and prosecution of Julian Assange, well, it's a far more dangerous assault on freedom of the press than it might at first have appeared. For in prosecuting Assange, remember, the Trump administration dug very deep into the Espionage Act and found a little unused section to prosecute him with. And under that section, anyone who simply quote-unquote receives or quote-unquote retains national defense information is guilty and can be prosecuted under the espionage. And Matt Taibbi, one of the authors in this marvelous book, and we're going to hear from Margaret Ratner-Kunstler later, who is one of the editors of the book. Matt Taibbi, in the book entitled In Defense of Julian Assange, makes the point that if the government is allowed to get away with using this tool successfully to prosecute reporters and publishers, in very short order, there won't be any publishers or reporters. Shamefully, in the beginning, not all in the US media even, as they should, came to the support of Julian Assange. They didn't understand the threat to themselves, as well as the broader civil liberties community and the threat to freedom of the press. For that matter, I'm sad to say there were a good number of people in the civil liberties community who should have known better, who also did not initially come to the defense of Assange. They were misled for one reason or another by the many vicious rumors and charges against Assange. And happily today you'll hear from one of our early speakers who will talk about how those charges and those rumors were not true, are not true, and in any event should not have been used by some in the civil liberties community to hesitate to come to Assange's defense. And what is true, and what should really alarm us, and alarm us greatly, is that the Trump administration is hell-bound, as we can see, on a campaign to silence any journalists and publishers who dare to expose the, well, really too many to name crimes and corrupt acts of the US government and other Western powers. In the Middle East and elsewhere. That's what Assange did, after all, with our war crimes in the Middle East. His disclosure through WikiLeaks is why we know about that. And yet it's obviously and painfully clear, at least to me, that freedom of the press is in grave danger in America. A grave danger, in fact, all around the world. The autocrats' dismissal of, critical news or fake news, the acceptance by all too many in the world of, alternative facts, the growing physical and political attacks on journalists everywhere around the world, including in this country, the lockout and lockup of journalists around the world who ask too many tough questions. Just the recent broadcasting to the American people of the impeachment hearing of Trump with only government cameras allowed to do it. Well, facing extradition to the United States and up to 175 years in prison for months and months now, Julian has been locked away in isolation and otherwise abused in England in a way that doctors who have examined him have said amounts to torture, and a torture that has taken a grave toll on Julian physically and mentally. Indeed, Nils Melzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, says, and I quote, "In 20 years of working with war victims, violence and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states unite to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for so long a time and with such little respect for human dignity and status of rights. Julian Assange's collective persecution must end," he says, "here and now." Well, for that to happen, all journalists and publishers of journalism, and everyone in America who still gives a damn about freedom of the press and the U.S. Constitution, has got to come to see the persecution and prosecution of Julian Assange for what it is and work together to end it. And so, friends, it seems to me that the only question that really should concern us today, and indeed not just concern us, but alarm us deeply and arouse within us a deep anger, is whether we're going to let Julian Assange's case become a final nail in the coffin of a free and independent press in America, or if we're going to fight like hell to save Julian, as we fight like hell to save freedom of the press. These are the critical questions we face today, and how we answer those questions, the importance of how we answer them, simply cannot be overestimated. After all, if our nation's press is not robust, is not free and independent and able to fearlessly subject to harsh scrutiny those who govern us, then we not only don't have a free press, but we don't have a democracy. And in fact, it seems to me it's clearer and clearer that our professed democracy has already slipped over that tipping point in America, and that we have now entered into a post-democratic state, an authoritarian state. In such a situation, is it therefore not clear that a free press is absolutely crucial if we hope to win back that lost democracy? And this is why it is so crucial that we defend Julian Assange. As one of Julian's lawyers, Jennifer Robinson, writes in the book in defense of Julian Assange, "We are living in a world," I quote, "we are living in a world where the person responsible for giving us the tools we need to achieve justice and accountability is in prison, while those responsible for the war crimes and human rights abuses he exposed continue to enjoy impunity. It is a grave injustice," she says, "that must be put right." And she says, "That is why I defend Assange and why we all should." Julian himself, in a May 13th letter of last year, writing from his horrific prison imprisonment in Britain, tells us that, quote, "I am unbroken, albeit literally surrounded by murderers. But the days when I could read and speak and organize to defend myself, my ideals, and my people are over until I am free. Everyone else," he says, "must take my place. I am defenseless, and I am counting on you and others of good character to save my life. Truth," he says, "ultimately is all we have." Finally, sisters and brothers, we who have organized this forum today are signaling today that we are determined to save Julian Assange's life, and that we invite you, indeed we urge you, to join us in that effort, in saving his life, and even more crucially, join us in saving freedom of the press in America, freedom to write, to speak, and publish the truth, for Julian is surely right. Ultimately, truth is all we have. Thank you. Well, thank you. Let me now introduce the moderator of today's panel, who in turn will introduce, our many marvelous speakers on behalf of the defense of Julian Assange and freedom of the press. She is Alvina Shaw. Ms. Shaw is, I am very proud to say, a member of the National Lawyers Guild chapter at UCLA's Law School, where she is a third-year student with concentrations in critical race studies, international and comparative law, and public interest law. In addition to the Lawyers Guild, she is also serving as a board member of the International Human Rights Law Association, and she has also served as editor-in-chief of the UCLA Law Journal. Alvina Shaw.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Jim, for the wonderful introduction and also for introducing the issues that we'll be discussing here today. My name is Alvina Shaw, and thank you all so much for joining us today, and welcome to UCLA Law. We are thrilled to be able to host this event, and thank you again to the NLG chapter of UCLA and the folks sitting outside and making sure everyone who wants to see the program today will be able to see it. Just a note about the transnational nature of both the persecution of Julian Assange and then also the opportunities, I think, for transnational solidarity that arise from this as well. We obviously, many states working together to ensure that Julian Assange is brought to the United States. We see when someone confronts Western power, what the consequences can be. And I'm also seeing opportunities here for a transnational movement to ensure that folks who do so are protected. And so, of course, we'll hear a little later from human rights attorneys and more about the transnational perspective. We see an Australian man working to send videos out of Iraq to the American people and the public of the whole world. And that opportunity for solidarity is premised on a very strong and robust right to freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom from persecution, freedom from unlawful detention. And so I am hoping that we can cover some of this ground here today. And so I do want to introduce our panelists, but I would also note that we have a minute-long video from Jennifer Robbins, one of Mr. Assange's attorneys. And so we'll cue that up now.
The case against Julian Assange sets a dangerous precedent for journalists and editors everywhere. Julian now faces 175 years in prison for publications which revealed evidence of war crimes, torture, and human rights abuse. Julian and WikiLeaks have won numerous awards the world over for this important work. The material was published together with more than 100 media partners around the world, including The Guardian, The New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, El País, and so many others. For now, Julian is the only person who's facing prosecution for publishing this material. But as we've warned since 2010, this is a precedent that can and will be used against editors and journalists everywhere. In this case, the United States government is setting up a precedent whereby any journalist or editor anywhere in the world that publishes truthful information in the public interest about the United States could face extradition and prosecution in the United States. What does this say to other countries like China or Russia? How would we react if Saudi Arabia sought to extradite a British or American journalist to face prosecution in Saudi Arabia for having published information about Saudi Arabia? Already we're seeing Bolsonaro's Brazil using the case theory that the United States is using against Julian Assange to prosecute American journalist Glenn Greenwald. Who will be next? Julian is now in a high security prison here in London where I have to go to visit him. He's asked me to pass on his sincere thanks to all of you and to the supporters that continue to turn up to protests and continue to support the work of the Courage Foundation. Thanks for your work.
Stephen Rohde is a civil liberties activist, historian, and writer who, while he was an attorney, practiced constitutional law for over 45 years. He is the former chair of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California and the author of American Words of Freedom and Freedom of Assembly. Mr. Rohde is also a contributor to the Los Angeles Review of Books. Mr. Rohde will be discussing the publications and disclosures by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks that led to the persecution and prosecution of Assange.
Come on, let's shoot. You're going to hear that again in a few moments from the collateral murder video. It's very important that we open this entire program with the full-length collateral murder video, and we're going to be showing excerpts of it during my remarks. It is the most forceful display of the importance of, I must begin with Chelsea Manning, in perhaps the first time we've mentioned her here today, who had the courage to leak this information in the first place. And is herself the victim of US law and persecution and torture. But she had the courage to do that, and Julian Assange had the courage to publish what she leaked. And today we're emphasizing the collateral murder video because it is the most striking and dramatic and compelling evidence of the millions of documents which Julian Assange published as a journalist and for which he stands extradition from England to face charges under the shameful, infamous Espionage Act of 1917. I want to join everyone who's been up here so far in applauding and recommending the book in defense of Julian Assange. This is an extraordinary piece of journalism in its own right. It is indispensable to anyone who wants to understand an accurate portrayal of Julian Assange the man and the publisher. It is filled with insightful essays and discussions, only a portion, a fraction of which we can scratch the surface with today, and that's why that book is on sale today for $20, and those seeing this video should go online to purchase In Defense of Julian Assange. I just said that for $20, but if you're online and watching this by video, then you're not in this room, and you should buy it anyway. I want to set the context very briefly of the chronology of this important case, because the chronology, which is published in the book, is very important and gets lost in a lot of the demonizing and trivializing of Julian Assange. It was in October of 2006 that WikiLeaks registered its domain name and began its work. I'll be emphasizing those portions of what it released that relate to today's program, but the breadth and depth beyond U.S. war crimes of what WikiLeaks has released is extraordinary in its own right. For example, in November of 2007, WikiLeaks published a copy of the U.S. Army's 2003 Standard Operating Procedure for Camp Delta, the protocol manual for soldiers stationed at Guantanamo Bay. But it was in the beginning of 2010 that we draw our attention. In February of 2010, WikiLeaks released the Reykjavik 13 cable relating to the IceSave scandal, which is beyond the scope today, but that was considered the first release of the first document by Chelsea Manning. But it was in April of 2010 that WikiLeaks released the collateral murder video, a classified gun sight video of a U.S. Army Apache helicopters targeted fire on unarmed civilians in Baghdad on July 12, 2007. That means no news source, no independent mainstream news source, nobody else had been able to obtain and publish that video for those 3 years until WikiLeaks did so after the help and support of Chelsea Manning. Over 12 civilians were killed, including 2 Reuters reporters, and 2 children were injured. Let's take a closer look at the first part of the collateral murder video.
Last calling station, Hotel 26. Hotel 26, District Romeo, do you want your Hotel 22 element?
And a black vehicle on our target, right to the north of the mosque.
Yeah, I would like that, over.
Moving south by the mosque dome, on that road.
Okay, we got a target 15 coming at you. It's a guy with a weapon. There's about 4 or 5.
Dispatcher 6, copy at 16.
This location, and there's more that keep walking by, and one of them has a weapon.
Roger, receive target 15.
Hotel 26. Okay. See all those people standing down there?
Stand by. Roger. Stay firm. And open courtyard.
Yeah, Roger. I just estimated
There's
about
about
20 of them.
There's one, yeah. Oh, yeah.
See Bushman, Sullivan, copy at White 6.
That's a weapon.
Yeah. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
Copy at White 6, Bushman 6, Romeo. Roger. Fucking break.
Hotel 26 is Crazy Horse 18. Have individuals with weapons. Yep, he's got a weapon too. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Have 5 to 6 individuals with AK-47s. Request permission to engage.
Roger that. We have no personnel east of our position, so you are free to engage over.
All right, we'll be engaging. Roger, go ahead. I can't get them now because they're behind that building.
Anybody has an element?
We got an RPG.
All right, we got a guy with an RPG.
I'm on a fire. Okay.
Hold on, let's come around.
Behind buildings right now from our point of view.
We're going to come around and get him from
Eyes on individual with RPG. Getting ready to fire. We won't get.
Yeah, we got a guy shooting. Now he's behind the building.
God damn it.
Speed coming around.
Next, he was right in front of the Brad. About there 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then.
Just fucking, once you get on, just open up.
Okay, Roger. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees out along this.
You're clear.
All right, firing.
Line here. With the space line. Let me know when you get it.
We'll shoot. Light them all up.
Come on, fire.
Yeah, Roger.
Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals.
Yeah, we got 2. We're still firing.
Roger.
Got him.
6 is a 2-6. We'll move, but we got
Oh, I'm sorry. I was on.
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle.
All right. I hit him.
We have engaged all 8 unarmed individuals. The best evidence is the alleged weapons were cameras strapped behind Reuters reporters. The United States and the Iraqi officials never allowed an on-the-ground investigation of this massacre. This is a war crime right before your very eyes. Before 1 o'clock today, how many people in this audience have seen collateral murder? Well, I love this audience. because for those watching, I'd say upwards of 75% of the people in this room have seen this. Have you seen it on CNN? Have you seen it on MSNBC? Have you seen it anywhere in the mainstream media? No. But this is what Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange was able to share with the world. In addition to scores of other documents. WikiLeaks continued to do so, and it was in May and June of 2010 that the U.S. military arrested Chelsea Manning and court-martialed her. She was put in solitary confinement, subjected to inhumane torture. It was in July that WikiLeaks published the Afghan war log, 75,000 of the 91,000 U.S. military documents on the Afghan war. And they continue to do so. I had intended to detail even more of these disclosures, but all you have to do is buy the book and read the chronology for yourself. This is what Julian Assange is being persecuted and prosecuted for. Now it was only in December of 2010, while Assange was being demonized, that the late Democratic Representative John Conyers of blessed memory, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, held a hearing on the espionage and WikiLeaks. What he said there should be repeated here. Quote, the repeated calls from members of Congress, the government, journalists and other experts crying out for criminal prosecution and other extreme measures caused me some consternation, he understated. Indeed, when everyone in this town is joined together calling for someone's head, it's a pretty good sign. We sure want to slow down and take a closer look. Well, the United States government and Congress and the mainstream media have never slowed down. It gets worse, and here is the second part video when rescuers came to care for what they didn't know were the dead and wounded, and this is what your government did then.
rolling over.
Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
Oh yeah, look at those dead bastards.
Nice. 26, Crazy Horse 18.
Thank you, Spear 02 flight. Free change zone 4 this time.
Spear 02, free change. Nice. Good shoot.
Thank you.
Hotel 26.
Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
Crazy Horse 18, Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
And Bushmaster 7, Crazy Horse 18. Location of bodies, Mike Bravo, 5458 8617.
Hey, good on the kitchen, that's good.
5458 8617, over.
It's Crazy Horse 18, that's a good copy. They're on a street in front of an open courtyard with a bunch of blue trucks, a bunch of vehicles in the courtyard.
There's one guy moving down there, but he's wounded.
To the south.
Alright, we'll let him know so they can hurry up, get over here.
It's 18. We also have one individual appears to be wounded, trying to crawl away.
Roger, we're going to move down there.
Roger, we'll cease fire.
Yeah, we won't shoot anymore. He's getting up.
If he has a weapon though in his hand?
No, I haven't seen one yet. We'll see. You guys got that guy crawling right now on the curb? Yeah, I got him. I put 2 rounds near him, and you guys are shooting over there too, so we'll see. Yeah, roger that.
Bushmaster 36 element, this is Hotel 27, over. Hotel 27, Bushmaster 7, go ahead. Roger, I'm just trying to make sure that you guys have my turb, over. Roger, we got the turb.
Come on, buddy.
All I gotta do is pick up a weapon.
Crazy Horse, this is Bushmaster 5, or Bushmaster 4, break. Here, right below you, right time now. Can you walk us onto that location, over?
This is 26, Roger. I'll pop flares. We also have one individual moving. We're looking for weapons. If we see a weapon, we're going to engage. Now, Bushmaster, we have a van that's approaching and picking up the bodies.
Where's that van at?
Right down there by the body.
Okay, yeah.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene. Looks like possibly picking up bodies and weapons.
Let me engage.
Hey, we need to stop that so we can get down there. We can shoot. South. Do you see my location?
Roger. Break. Crazy Horse 1, request permission to engage.
I'm picking up the wounded. Yeah, we're trying to get permission to engage. Come on, let us shoot.
A Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 18.
We're taking him.
Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 18.
This is Bushmaster 7, go ahead.
Roger, we have a black SUV or bongo truck picking up the bodies. Request permission to engage.
Bushmaster 7, Roger. This is Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage.
18, engage. Clear.
Come on.
Clear. Clear.
We're engaged.
Coming around, clear.
Roger. Trying to,
Clear.
Roger, I lost him in the dust.
I got him.
I'm firing.
George, this is Bushmaster 4. You got any BDA on that truck, over?
You're clear. This is Crazy Horse, stand by.
Not shooting for some reason.
Go ahead.
I think the van's disabled.
Go ahead and shoot it.
I got an azimuth limit for some reason.
Low left. Clear left. Alright, Bushmaster, Crazy Horse 18. A vehicle appears to be disabled. There was approximately 4 to 5 individuals in vehicle moving bodies. Your lead, Bradley, should take the next right and cruising east down the road. No more shoot.
Crazy Horse is Bushmaster 4. We're moving a dismounted element straight south from the Bradley.
I have your Bradley element turning south down the road where the engagements were.
Left call on stations Bradley element. Say again.
Roger's Crazy Horse. Your lead Bradley just turned south down the road where all the engagements happened. Should have a van in the middle of the road with about 12 to 15 bodies.
Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
Alright, there was approximately 4 to 5 individuals.
They asked how good Germans could have ever done what the Nazis did. How could good soldiers go to war and do what they did? These are American soldiers, eager, anxious, yearning to pull the trigger and to kill all of those innocent people. It is tragic, and we owe it to Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. I cut my time short so that we could see these videos. I want to close with a statement prepared for this program today by John Kiriakou. John Kiriakou is a former CIA officer who blew the whistle on CIA torture by telling ABC News that the CIA was torturing prisoners. He became the 6th whistleblower indicted by the Obama administration under the Espionage Act. Those are whistleblowers indicted under the Espionage Act. Julian Assange is the first publisher and journalist indicted under the Espionage Act. And John spent 23 months in prison as a result of his revelations. He tells us today, "I'm honored to support Julian Assange in his quest for freedom and in his larger fight for transparency. It was Julian who in 2010 told the world the United States was committing war crimes in Iraq. It was Julian who later told Americans, thanks to the Snowden revelations, that the United States was spying on its own people. Is Julian controversial? Yes, he is. But truth tellers often are. And WikiLeaks has never had to retract a story, ever. Now the full weight of the U.S. government has come down on his head, and Julian is being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, a law designed to punish spies. This case is bigger than just Julian Assange. This case is about press freedom and freedom of speech. It's about transparency and official corruption. It's about frightening other journalists into keeping their mouths shut when they uncover evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality. That's why we have to stand with Julian Assange. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Vincent DiStefano. He'll be addressing the charges and rumors leveled at Julian Assange. Vincent is a graduate of UCLA, go Bruins. He's been deeply involved with progressive issues over the past 45 years. He's a member of the board of the Pasadena chapter of the ACLU of Southern California and has worked on police reform as a member of the Coalition for Increased Oversight of the Pasadena Police. He's been involved with Amnesty International for over 4 decades, and in 2019 was recognized by them as the Urgent Action Letter Writer of the Year. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. First and foremost, I'm humbled to share the stage with people who are much smarter and better than I am. However, I want to address the picture of Julian Assange that was presented ad nauseum to the world, and it's not a pretty picture. But as I'm reaching out to my good friends and family in the progressive community for their input and attendance at this very event, more often than not, I was met with utter disdain. And women who I know and respect that I work with on progressive causes many times would ask me, why would I defend this rapist? Julian Assange has been vilified not only as a rapist, but a misogynist, a racist, both an anti-Semite and a Nazi. He's been accused of costing Hillary Clinton the election, of being in cahoots with Trump and Russia. He's been presented as an active part of the right-wing wave of white supremacists and the left-wing wave of anarchists. He's even been accused of kidnapping the Lindbergh baby. Kidding about the last one. Caitlin Johnson, in defense of Julian Assange, which is an excellent book and you should all get and read, says in her introduction, have you ever noticed how whenever someone inconveniences the dominant Western power structure, the entire political social media class rapidly becomes very interested in telling us what an evil and disgusting that person is, how evil and disgusting they are. Now, I would like to directly address what I believe is the most damaging accusation Julian faces, and that is that he is a rapist. Not just a rapist, but a coward who ran from the charges and been hiding out to prevent a just hearing of those accusations. I got to tell you truthfully that I was appalled when I heard this. I have a mother, I have a wife, a sister, female relatives, and I know they face misogyny, abuse, and completely reprehensible behavior by men of all stripes on an ongoing basis with impunity. The story offered by the mainstream press was simple. Julian had forced himself on and raped 2 women, and then he fled to Sweden, and then he refused to return or answer any question, fled from Sweden, and refused to answer any questions of these serious accusations. However, as I looked into the facts, I found a full decade later that this still remains only an allegation, not a charge. One that Julian has denied without being given a chance to defend himself in a court of law. Just imagine yourselves being accused of rape for 9.5 years by an entire state apparatus, by an entire world media, without being given the chance to defend yourself. In point of fact, these charges have been dropped not once, but twice for lack of cause. I'll get into that in a moment. The fact that Julian had consensual sex with 2 women in August 2010 has been agreed to by all parties, including the 2 women in question. In the end, all that one of the individuals wanted was to compel Julian to take an HIV test. When she was told that Julian was be charged with rape, actually minor rape in Sweden, which is a different charge altogether, she, according to authorities and her own testimony, she was appalled. Rape was something that she categorically denied. Her original testimony was that a rape never had taken place at all. However, her testimony was later changed by the Stockholm police without her involvement, consent, or signature in order to somehow make it appear as if a rape had taken place. Perhaps there was a reason. These charges arose just about 4 weeks after the WikiLeaks collateral murder tape that we just saw. The release of this video exposed a wanton war crime perpetrated by our government in Iraq, the U.S. government, a war crime that the U.S. was doing its damnedest to cover up. The very same government that offered us the lie of the weapons of mass destruction, which has led to our current quagmires in the Middle East, was pressuring the Swedish authorities to move forward with rape allegations which neither of the individuals involved to have said to have happened. Is anyone in this audience surprised that they did so to obscure their own war crimes that WikiLeaks had just shared with the world? Here are the facts. On August 10th, an arrest warrant was issued, but senior Swedish prosecutor Eva Finn quashed the charges and dropped them 5 days later, stating that they showed no evidence of a crime at all. The truth is that Julian Assange never ran from these charges either. In fact, he presented himself to Swedish authorities numerous times to provide his defense, but was stonewalled each time. Then, when he planned to travel to the UK, he contacted the Swedish authorities to seek and was granted their permission to go. Now, since we're short on time, I'm going to truncate this. A clear understanding of the facts shows that Julian Assange was not running from justice, but was escaping from injustice inflicted by the most powerful nation in the world, the nation that had just been embarrassed by his revelations of war crimes, and that they wished never to see the light of day. Their intent was to punish Julian Assange mercilessly, was by design a very clear message to other whistleblowers: the fate that awaits you if you stand against the imperialist juggernaut that is the United States and its cohorts. Allegations of rape must be thoroughly investigated, and those found guilty must face justice. However, Julian was not investigated, but rather targeted. When the facts of the case were not to the liking of the U.S. State Department, they were simply fabricated, and Swedish authorities and Interpol were pressured to pursue a case without willing victims, without evidence, and wholly without merit. WikiLeaks and courageous individuals like Julian Assange present an existential threat to the political elite in all governments because they publish information we have a right to know. But governments wish to hide from us, not for state security, but simply to cover up their own corruption and crimes. They will do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening, including destroying the lives of those who stand up against them. Julian is one of those lives that is being destroyed at this very moment. To quote Jesselyn Resnick from in defense of Julian Assange, how we treat journalists, sources, activists, dissidents in the future. If Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are criminally prosecuted, the New York Times and its reporters are equally vulnerable. I will close. The late Michael Ratner says in one of the very first pages of In Defense of Julian Assange, never doubt the mendacity and cruelty of the state. It will make pariahs out of those who will one day be recognized as heroes. That, unfortunately, is the case Julian Assange faces today. Thank you very much.
Robert Corsini is a widely respected documentary filmmaker, producer, and writer. He is the owner of Videocratic Media, and Robert Corsini is responsible for filming the videos that we've been seeing and that we will continue to see today. So. And now Robert Corsini with his footage.
So thank you all for being here, of course. Quite a moving expose that Stephen reiterated for us. Thank you. This opportunity to have this conference, this forum here today, afforded me the chance to go and interview two really important people in the history of the progressive left in the United States, Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg. And their stories actually relate directly to what is happening here with Julian Assange today when it comes to, in terms of freedom of speech and the defense of the freedom of the press as well. So I'm going to let Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg speak for themselves right now on that issue. And I am going to roll the tape right now and have a look. Why does Julian Assange, in the case of Julian Assange, matter to America and freedom of the press today?
The attempt to extradite and prosecute Julian Assange, and he's already been indicted, is a direct assault on the freedom of the press, on the First Amendment, and on journalism here in general. It's the very first prosecution of a journalist for doing journalism, criminalizing journalism, in effect, in this country, in blatant violation of the First Amendment. My case, many years ago, was the first prosecution of anyone as a whistleblower for leaking information, classified information, to the public. There have been many leaks before, but no prosecutions, precisely because of the First Amendment, which obviously forbade such prosecutions. So my prosecution was an experiment to see whether some law, in this case the Espionage Act, so-called Espionage Act, could be used against the non-espionage defendant. I wasn't claimed to be a spy. It was recognized that I was a source. In fact, they knew, acting out of patriotic motives, to give information to the public that the government did not want out because it revealed violations of treaties, it revealed decades of lying to the American public and of secret threats that had increasingly escalated a wrongful, hopeless, murderous war. Like, for example, the war that we have waged on Iraq for many years now, and was impending just last week as we speak, actually, against Iran. I don't think any of those wars would have existed, would have come about, had there been whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning or Ed Snowden, both of whom were facilitated by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. If that had been, if the public and the Congress had been told about the planning, the threats, the lies involved in those operations, I think that what amount to millions of people ultimately would have lived, would have had their lives spared. I wish that had happened just last week as we speak here now, in early January, where many people must have understood that what the newspapers described as their stunning reaction, they're being stunned to President Trump's choice of what was called an option, but a clearly illegal, unconstitutional murder, political murder of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. I think that there would have been certainly opposition in Congress and in the public of a kind that we did not see apparently inside the executive branch. The point here is that for many years, whistleblowers have been essentially needed if we were to avert both unconstitutional and terrible, wrongful wars.
Julian Assange performed a major service. He has found ways to gain access to materials that the population should definitely know about, and he's released them to the public. An effort. For this, he's already been very severely punished. He was under very punitive house arrest for years, sequestered in the Ecuadorian embassy. They kicked him out. He's been placed in a high-security prison. His life is in danger from the treatment he's received, and he's now facing the threat of very severe punishment by the U.S. government for the services that he's performed for the public. A matter of extreme importance for those who care about the brutal and unfair treatment of someone, and also who care about the right of citizens to gain access to knowledge about what their elected representatives are doing.
So I just want to explain a little bit about my background as a documentary filmmaker. I worked for several different companies over the years, and I had the opportunity to work on a project about the Armenian genocide. And in so doing, I was given the task to interview Julian Assange. And I went, okay, well, I don't quite know what the connection is, but let me find out if there is one. And in fact, thanks to what we have now available to us and being able to research things that you never could have done before, I found an obscure clip of Julian Assange speaking to issues surrounding the Armenian genocide. I'm like, oh, he actually has something to say about this subject. And as I got more into it, I started to realize this is actually a very rich environment, genocide, human rights. And of course, the connection here was with Julian Assange was becoming more and more clear. Push come to shove, my friend Stephen Rohde helped me connect with Michael Ratner, and we basically figured out a way to get to Julian Assange. And in fact, I interviewed Julian Assange from my garage in Mount Washington near downtown Los Angeles, and I hired a crew in London to do the video work. And lo and behold, I was able to interface with him, and he exposed to us some pretty amazing things about Turkey, about the relationship between the United States and Turkey, and how deep it goes in terms of, I was going to read this, in fact, I'm going to read this quote because it's really great. This is an excerpt from my interview with Julian. And normally I would have it on tape, but I think it's better just to read it in some ways. It's quite clear, this is Julian Assange speaking to me, it's quite clear from the cable traffic, in fact, the greatest source of cables and cables that we have released in terms of the numbers is from Ankara, the US mission in Ankara. Why is that? The United States sees Turkey as one of the most important countries in the world geostrategically. You can see that nakedly from our cable release. The greatest number of cables is from Ankara because of the central place that Turkey placed within the Middle East, in Europe, and Asia. It is the point that connects all those other points. In fact, that's why Turkey became such a powerful empire. It was because of this central geostrategic position. Also, let's not forget that Turkey was an empire under the Ottomans within the last 100 years, and there's been a concern that it might, again, one day become an empire. And so the British and the Americans have tried to keep control of Turkey in a variety of ways. Now Turkey militarily is the second largest country in NATO after the United States itself. When Turkey is unified and is able to say, hey, look, unless you do what we want, we are going to approach Israel in a different way. We're going to approach Syria in a different way. We're going to approach the Russians in a different way. We're going to approach Europe in a different way. It is able, that is Turkey, it is able to extort all sorts of concessions from Europe and the United States, and it's done exactly that in relation to the in relation to the Armenian genocide. So for many years, what I learned on this project, Architects of Denial, was the connection between this corruption of genocide denial and what is being, and the necessity of having entities such as WikiLeaks being able to expose this kind of information. And so I am going to play just the trailer to Architects of Denial so you can understand a little bit about how all this syncs up. And so it's just not about what's happening in the Iraq war logs. It's much broader. It has a much more important aspect to it, and this is also evidence and proof that the work of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange is really about journalism. It's really about research. It's really about learning how to tell the truth.
We love this land, and we will never leave it.
There's overwhelming evidence to support that there was a serious Armenian genocide.
The deliberate destruction of an entire people.
Forcibly marching women and children to death.
Parties at the time sending back cables, newspaper reports, eyewitnesses, and so on. Turkey has gone around the world aggressively lobbying to make sure there are no references to the Armenian genocide.
And why do they kill us? Just because we're not one of them. We're different. Armenian people have been running for generation after generation.
At least 1.5 million were killed. The most brutal forms of killing.
Somebody shouted, "Open the door, we will kill all Armenians."
Denial may continue for 100 years or more afterwards.
You can get away with murder, literally, and nothing will happen to you.
Major powers, such as the United States, do not recognize the Armenian genocide.
Governments say we are doing this, but sometimes we have to do evil deeds because the end justifies the means. I have received more gag orders than any other person in the history of this country. I've been witnessing criminal activities which constitutes treason.
Deny the facts, deny the statistics.
Do you deny that the Armenian genocide happened?
I do deny that.
So they kept beating him and he kept walking.
I saw 2 people being killed. I saw this with my own eyes.
How is 1.5 million deaths not a genocide? Is the Turkish lobby not allowing you to answer this question?
I want people to know the truth.
Hitler once famously said, "Who remembers Armenia?" The answer is the whole world. That's who.
This is an important question because Christian Armenians are being killed and persecuted to this day.
That's just the trailer for the film, but it also afforded me other opportunities. And in fact, not long after I interviewed Julian Assange, I had the pleasure of meeting our next speaker, Bianca Bagaturian B, who basically is a playwright. And we were connected through a mutual friend as I was doing research on this project. And essentially, I was telling her about interviewing Julian Assange, and she said, "Well, I've had this idea about a play about Julian Assange, and could you hook me up with some connection?" And I said, "Well, now that I have those connections, yes, I can." And in fact, not long after that, she was on her way to London, and she's here with us to talk about her play called Gaslighting.
Robert. I was going to say I'm a playwright and human rights activist, but now I will say I'm an Armenian playwright and human rights activist after your trailer. I've always been very interested in writing about the truth. My last play, which was just staged in London, was about historian Howard Zinn, about his life and work, and we worked together on that before his passing. And I strive to do this through engaging in empathetic ways to make audiences and the public feel like they can participate and engage in it. So in the Zinn project, we used a lot of song and dance. Now, I think it was Vincent who was mentioning, when I tell anyone I'm working on a play about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, I also face a lot of disdain. 10 out of 10 people just say, why? And 10 out of these 10 people, it really angers me, have not even visited the WikiLeaks website. And it just makes me try and think, what is this gap where I don't know what's blocking them? Is it fear? Is it just lack of interest? We all have such busy lives. But I've been trying to think, in my role as an artist, how can I reflect this and bring it closer to everyday public, so we're not just preaching to the choir, as you just mentioned. So I came up with this idea based on the 1938 Patrick Hamilton play Gaslight, which I don't know if many of you have heard of, but you probably know about the 1944 MGM movie called Gaslight, which starred Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. In fact, Ingrid Bergman was nominated for an Academy Award. The film was nominated for many. But it seemed to me that if I could somehow bring what WikiLeaks and Julian is doing down to a personal level, that perhaps people would then have a connection to it. So I came up with this idea, and I'm very pleased to say that I've now been commissioned since we talked last by an Australian artistic director to write this play, so we are in the midst of doing this. Fingers crossed. And we hope to stage it in London later this year. Nate Jones is he was the artistic director of the Australian Theatre Company here in Los Angeles. It has now been rebranded as United Stages, and it does plays about human rights. So in this play, the play takes place in the Ecuadorian embassy in Julian's living space, and he's watching the movie Gaslight, and Paula, Ingrid Bergman, steps out of the movie into the Ecuadorian embassy, and the play is a two-hander, a discussion between Julian and Paula, Ingrid Bergman, about being gaslit, and her talking about it on a personal level and the consequences and what you suffer when someone distorts your reality, and when you become a victim and everything you're thinking is happening is not happening and something different is happening, and Julian explaining how that's what governments and institutions do to people today. So that's what we are working on now. I hope you will all come and see it when it's out. I'm sure we'll try and stage it here. Thank you.
I am delighted to introduce Barry Pollock. Barry Pollock is Julian Assange's lawyer in America. Mr. Pollock is a criminal defense lawyer in Washington, D.C., widely respected in the legal community. He's been selected into the super lawyers every year from 2007 to 2020. Barry will detail and analyze the indictment of Julian Assange.
Thank you. As we've learned here today, it was back in 2013 that Chelsea Manning was convicted of leaking the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, the State Department cables to WikiLeaks, who published those back in 2010 and 2011. As was just mentioned, in 2013, the Obama administration, after Manning was convicted, it was widely reported, decided that they would not charge Julian Assange, even though they had charged and convicted the leaker, because you could not, in any principled way, charge a publisher for publishing truthful information. The Obama administration referred to what it called the New York Times problem. If we were to charge Julian Assange for publishing this information, how could we not charge the New York Times for what it does every day of the week? In December of 2017, the Trump administration's Department of Justice secretly charged Julian Assange criminally. And of course, in April of this past year, 2019, he was expelled from the embassy, and the United States sought extradition on that charge that had been pending secretly since December of 2017. He was charged with conspiracy to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If you read the Department of Justice's press release, the press release said, WikiLeaks founder charged in computer hacking conspiracy. Well, that's how they solved the New York Times problem. We're not going to charge him for publishing, we're going to charge him for computer hacking. The only problem is, if you read the charging document, the word hacking doesn't appear anywhere in it. When Julian said, if I'm a journalist and I write a story, if I provide you the source documents, you can tell for yourself whether or not I'm telling you the truth. He was onto something. In fact, what the allegation in the indictment is that Chelsea Manning at some point asked someone who the government alleges was Assange, but someone affiliated with WikiLeaks, for help in trying to figure out if she could log onto her computer, not under her own name, but under the administrator's name, so it wouldn't be obvious that she was the one who was leaking this material. Computer hacking, at least to me, is gaining access through a computer to something that you don't otherwise have access to. Manning had access to all of this material, had leaked hundreds of thousands of documents using her own name, wanted to continue to leak documents, but didn't want to leave fingerprints on it if you believe the indictment. Also, if you believe the indictment, Assange came back and said, no luck, I'm not able to help you. And then Manning continued to leak under her own name. In other words, there's not a single document that was leaked or published as a result of this so-called hacking attempt. A month or so after Mr. Assange was expelled from the embassy, the United States brought a superseding indictment, charging not only the conspiracy to commit computer fraud and abuse, but charging 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act. At this point, the fig leaf that this was not a prosecution about the publication of truthful information had come off. 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act. He can get 5 years for the computer fraud and abuse violation. He can get 170 years, 10 years each, on the Espionage Act charges, a total of 175 years. The government makes one other effort, I think, to try to at least disguise the New York Times problem. What they've said publicly about the Espionage Act charges is, well, we're not charging him for publishing the collateral murder video. We're charging him because he's not a journalist. What he did was he published en masse the raw data, the raw files that included the names of sources that had helped the United States putting these people at risk. And of course, no responsible journalist would ever do that. Well, again, there are a couple of problems with the government's spin. First of all, Assange had all of this material. WikiLeaks had all of this material from Manning. It could have published all of it en masse at any time and scooped the whole world. It didn't. What it did is it gave this information to the New York Times, to The Guardian, and to Der Spiegel so that these journalistic entities could go through the material and try to redact items that would cause undue harm. while it was in the possession of the Guardian, the password for these encrypted files became known, and a number of sources got a hold of the raw material and put the raw material online. It was only after the material was online already that WikiLeaks made the decision, well, if it's already been published, we can put it on the WikiLeaks site. So factually there's a problem there, but I think there's a bigger problem than that even. The idea that the United States government should say, we don't agree with the editorial judgments that you made about what to publish, so therefore we're going to charge you with violating the Espionage Act, runs counter to the entire history of the First Amendment. We have always believed that it is up to publishers and journalists to make the decision as to what to publish, not to the government. And I think we should all be frightened by the prospect that the United States government is going to act as the editor-in-chief for every publication, not just in the United States, but for every publication around the globe. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome Sharon Kyle. Ms. Kyle is an attorney and law professor and the former president and CEO of the People's College of Law in Los Angeles. She's also a board member of the ACLU of Southern California. Sharon Kyle is also the publisher of the LA Progressive, a daily online publication that focuses on social justice issues. She will be addressing issues of freedom of the press in the age of the internet.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to correct a couple of things in my bio. I'm no longer the president of People's College of Law, and I am not a practicing attorney. But I was a law professor there and the president for 7 years, and currently I am the publisher of the LA Progressive, and I would like to talk about freedom of the press, although I have to say that just consuming what we've been consuming here in this past 45 minutes is shifting my thoughts about what I want to talk about, even though freedom of the press, well, as we all know, and I can tell by this audience, you know that the press is protected by the Constitution, and it in fact is the only enterprise that is mentioned in the Constitution, the press. But we also know that the Constitution is not self-enforcing. And so it is imperative that all of us have a deep understanding as to why the press is called the fourth estate and how the press, in fact, establishes the foundation that our democracy is built on. Unfortunately, I happen to be a member of a class of people who are accustomed to having our civil liberties violated and accustomed to not having our First Amendment rights protected. I'm being told to bring it down. Is that good? Thank you. So what we're seeing here with Julian Assange is the criminalization of the sharing of truth. That's nothing new in the United States. It's critical now because just last month, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists published the new doomsday account. The doomsday clock is set for 100 seconds till midnight. At no time in history have we ever been here. We have two existential threats to our continued existence on this planet: the nuclear threat and the global climate warming, which the right continues to deny is even a problem. So someone asked me earlier when we were about to begin this program, is this going to be another program where we're all just preaching to the choir? And I said, yes, it is. And Steve asked, had people seen this documentary? And most of the audience raised their hands. Yes, they had seen it, and I've seen most of this footage myself. But I'd like to bring something more to the fore. Freedom of the press is essential, but just having the knowledge of violations of civil liberties themselves, That in and of itself has never changed anything. I once heard the president, maybe it was the executive director of Amnesty International, say that when he became the executive director, he believed that by sharing widely all of the kinds of abuses and torture and the terrible ways that human beings come up with treating other human beings, he thought that by letting people know that there would be a change. And sadly, he found there was no change. So while the freedom of the press is essential to a strong democracy and transparency is essential, there are other components that are essential that we're missing, I believe, as a progressive movement. And that is understanding the centrality of race. Now, for many years, I have come to this college, the law school of UCLA, and they conduct a series that Alvina is working with, which is called Critical Race Theory. Critical race theory talks about the nexus between empire and race, the nexus between these kinds of violations, civil liberties violations, and how the deep-pocketed, the elite, establish a stronghold in society. They glean their power by oppressing marginalized people, and then they'll start to oppress everyone else. So Lonnie Guinier, thanks, sister. So Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres wrote a book called The Coal Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, and Transforming Democracy. And what I'm talking about and what they talk about is that they talk about the canary being a way to alert the miners of a poisonous atmosphere. Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Thomas say that black and brown communities, particularly black communities, are the canaries of our society. They say that like the canaries that alerted miners to a poisonous atmosphere, issues of race point to underlying problems in society that ultimately affect everyone, not just minorities. I was watching an interview between Noam Chomsky and Kathleen Cleaver, former Black Panthers member. And Noam Chomsky was doing a comparison between COINTELPRO and Watergate. And he said those two major events happened at approximately the same time. But you can pretty much ask any person on the street, have they ever heard of Watergate? And they'll say yes. If you ask them about COINTELPRO, I can guarantee you they're not going to know. Most of you probably know about COINTELPRO. What Noam Chomsky pointed out was the difference between the victims whose civil liberties were violated and why it mattered in one case, and in the other case, it didn't matter. And by allowing J. Edgar Hoover the kind of power that he had, I believe, for 40 years or more, he did just what was done to Julian Assange, to so many people, to Martin Luther King. So when Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres talk about the coal miner's canary, what they're saying is we have models. All we have to do is look, and you will see your own future. Sadly, we are at such a critical time. We just cannot afford to ignore this, and we cannot afford to continue what used to be state-sanctioned segregation, which is now socially sanctioned segregation. I look across this room, and I maintain that we still live segregated lives. All I have to do is drive down Sepulveda Boulevard or across Wilshire, and I know that we live segregated lives. Ultimately, the lack of unity and the lack of a strong progressive movement, that will be the thing that will destroy us.
I'd like to invite Mr. Schenkman to the stage. Carrie Schenkman is an attorney, litigator, and author, specializing in human rights and constitutional law. He works with numerous organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights. Mr. Schenkman is also an advisor to Colombia's Global Freedom of Expression campaign. Carrie Schenkman will speak of the implications for freedom of the press by the government's use of the Espionage Act to indict Mr. Assange. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to say it's an honor to be present here with such a compelling program and very, very necessary. I do want to make one quick disclosure that I did work on Julian's case for the late Michael Ratner for several years before his passing. Actually,
Thank you.
and as part of that case, we actually brought a successful lawsuit before the United Nations, which some of you might be aware of. We filed a petition before the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, where we were able to successfully argue that the situation in the Ecuadorian embassy amounted to arbitrary detention under international law. And I think something that is really important to point out about that specific case was that we had international law, an international body recognized under the UN, issued an opinion saying that Julian won, that this was illegal conduct. And the UK and the US completely ignored it. And I think that should really set the precedent for how we should expect any extradition proceedings to proceed, anything potentially before the European Court of Human Rights, and any supposed faith that we might have about respect for the rule of law or for international legal instruments or treaties. But today, what I really want to talk to you about is another topic that's been close to me over the past several years, which is the Espionage Act. And for the past 5 years, I've been co-authoring a book on the Espionage Act, specifically on its political history and the way that it's been used to specifically attempt to control information and target political movements. And one thing that I wanted to address is something that I think is a big assumption, and sadly, I think a way that many of us have fallen to the US government's marketing about the Espionage Act, is that somehow the Espionage Act is being misused. That no, this is a law about prosecuting spies. This is an espionage law. And it is being wrongly misappropriated to prosecute whistleblowers. It's being wrongly used against Julian Assange. But in fact, the Espionage Act is being used exactly how it was intended to be used. It is not an espionage law. And we need to stop calling it an espionage law. It is an information control law. And to see that, we have to look no further than the actual legislative history and the political history of this law, which was passed just a few months after US entry into World War I. And in fact, in his speech, advocating for U.S. entry into the war, which is a little ironic because Woodrow Wilson ran on the platform of keeping the U.S. out of war. Wilson said ominously, if there should be disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of stern repression. And when the Espionage Act was proposed, and I'll add that the Wilson administration and his DOJ actually wanted to have a law like the British Official Secrets Act, which goes further than the Espionage Act to impose strict liability for any disclosure of classified information. Wilson basically looked at that law and said, hey, that looks great, let's have something like this here. But when the Espionage Act was proposed, Wilson said that disloyal Americans, quote, had sacrificed their right to civil liberties. Among the first 2,000 prosecutions under the Espionage Act were prosecutions for speech and opinion in opposition to the war. In fact, many of these prosecutions were for publication. One little wrinkle is that the case against Julian is not the first case under the Espionage Act for publication. In fact, the early Supreme Court cases, the very first cases leading to our First Amendment doctrine, were Espionage Act cases involving the distribution of leaflets, the idea of the lonely pamphleteer who has as much a right to exercise First Amendment rights as the big media institutions like the New York Times and Washington Post. And defendants were often prosecuted for spreading such leaflets. Another context for the original passage of the Espionage Act is the fact that a year later, in 1918, it was paired with the Sedition Act, the first such sedition act passed in this country since 1798, which we all might remember from US history. And that act punished, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about war or the system and government. While that Sedition Act was ultimately repealed, the focus and omen of the Espionage Act remained, and that served as a guiding principle for individuals such as J. Edgar Hoover, whose career started in the investigation of Espionage Act cases. It also propelled the rise of the ACLU, which was involved in the early defense of Espionage Act defendants. The Espionage Act was famously used to prosecute the Wobblies, including William Big Bill Haywood, as well as 100 other labor leaders in a mass political trial. Interestingly, with Haywood, he ended up leaving the US and being exiled none else than Moscow, an interesting place to spend the rest of his days. And 100 years later, we can think of another Espionage Act defendant currently exiled in Moscow. Also, Eugene Debs, the socialist presidential candidate, faced 10 years imprisonment under the Espionage Act for what was considered the most famous protest speech of his time, that was the Canton, Ohio speech. He received nearly 1 million votes from prison. So let's keep this in mind when we think about the nature of this prosecution and whether or not this is really a legal case or a political case. In fact, the Espionage Act has been highly contentious since its passage. One of the prominent narratives that you'll hear about the Espionage Act today, especially from the Justice Department, is that this is simply a violation of law, that this is, you look at the black letter of the law, we're simply enforcing and applying the laws, and this was a clear violation of law. But when you look from bipartisan criticism across the board for the last century, there's been unanimous confusion and criticism of this law. You have in 1979, the CIA's own general counsel, I can read to you, Tony Lapham was his name. He testified before Congress that the espionage is, quote, so vague and opaque as to be virtually worthless. And also, likely that the very obscurity of these laws serves to deter perfectly legitimate expression and debate. 2 Columbia law professors in 1973, following the unsuccessful prosecution of Daniel Ellsberg, those were Harold Edgar and Benno Schmidt Jr., their law review article, it's over 100 pages long. It's considered widely the authoritative legislative analysis of the Espionage Act. Their conclusion is that the law is, quote, in many respects incomprehensible. They also add that it poses the greatest threat to the acquisition and publication of defense information by reporters and newspapers. In fact, in 1917, one of the opponents of the Espionage Act, Senator William E. Borah of Idaho, called it unconstitutional, un-American, unwise, and unnecessary, adding that no one can foresee all the evils to flow from it. That was over 100 years ago. I'd just like to finish by debunking another myth about the Espionage Act, that there's a possibility for a fair trial under this law. And we saw this narrative a lot with Snowden. In fact, something that Barack Obama liked to say a lot was that he needs to come back and face the music. He needs to come back and face trial. But under the Espionage Act, there is no opportunity for a defense. The revelation of war crimes, the revelation of corruption, of any misconduct is completely irrelevant, is literally irrelevant. In fact, the Justice Department's position right now is that by offering such a defense is essentially an admission of guilt, because the element of the offense is the disclosure of information. We can see the current administration's position on this issue by looking at the prosecution of Daniel Hale, who is a former NSA analyst who's allegedly an intercept source of Jeremy Scales' drone papers. And quoting from their papers in that case, they said, quote, the defense likely will want to argue that even if the defendant engaged in the conduct alleged, he had good reasons to leak the documents at issue and is being unfairly prosecuted under criminal statutes that carry significant penalties. Any such arguments, however, would be entirely improper. The defendant may wish for his criminal trial to become a forum on something other than his guilt, but those debates cannot and do not inform the core questions in this case: whether the defendant illegally retained and transferred the documents he stole. That is the state of this law, the Espionage Act. There will be no opportunity for a defense in the public interest. And in this respect, the United States is an outlier. It's the only country on earth that has a law governing the disclosure of secret information that doesn't offer proportionality defense, and such a failure of this defense is a violation of international law and international standards. I wish that I could leave that on a more positive note, but but I'm happy to address more. We have some limited time. There's quite a lot of rich history for the Espionage Act. One thing that I will leave on, actually, I think in dealing with the topic of intersectionality and the use of the Espionage Act, there's a very little known episode under FDR's administration where J. Edgar Hoover and FDR actually tried to target the black press under the Espionage Act for their opposition to the war effort. And in fact, J. Edgar Hoover was sending monthly memos to the Attorney General Francis Biddle saying, why won't you prosecute this publication under the Espionage Act? We can imagine similar things are happening today and will only continue to happen in light of this case.
Thank you so much. I'd like to welcome Marjorie Cohn to the stage. Marjorie is a professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, a former national president of the National Lawyers Guild, a criminal defense attorney who is a legal scholar who writes books and articles and lectures throughout the world about human rights, foreign policy, and the conflicts between the two. She is the author of The United States of Torture, Cameras in the Courtroom, and Drones and Targeted Killings, among other books. Her columns appear on Truthout, HuffPost, Salon, Truthdig, and other online publications. Professor Cohn will be addressing the legality of the U.S. seeking to extradite Julian Assange back to the U.S. under the extradition treaty with England.
Thank you, and I'm so pleased to be here for this important event and with my colleagues on the panel, of whom I am in awe, so thank you. Julian Assange is facing an extradition hearing on February the 25th, and the U.S. and the U.K. have an extradition treaty that was concluded in 2003. So the United States is trying to convince the U.K. to extradite Assange to the United States for trial. Under this extradition treaty, extradition shall not be granted if the offense for which the extradition is requested is a political offense. And extradition shall not be granted if the competent authority of the UK determines that the request was politically motivated. In the United States, the executive branch, and of course you know who that is the competent authority for purposes of this act. And I use competent only because it's the word that's used in the treaty. Now, like most extradition treaties, the U.S.-UK extradition treaty excludes political offenses. There's no clear definition of that term, but it routinely covers crimes like treason, espionage, and sedition, as well as offenses that are directed against the power of the state in some manner. Julian Assange is wanted in the United States primarily for embarrassing the Department of Defense and the State Department by publishing true information that was obtained from Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower, which makes the charges political in nature as opposed to criminal. Edward Snowden, who is currently living under a grant of asylum in Russia, could have been extradited to the United States if Russia or Hong Kong, where he left, or Ecuador, which he was on his way to Ecuador, had wanted to extradite him, and had he not been granted asylum in Russia. He's another very prominent whistleblower who blew the whistle on massive surveillance by the National Security Agency collecting our metadata, and he is wanted, of course, in the United States at the present time. The U.S. and Russia do not have an extradition treaty, although under the Obama administration and other administrations, people have been extradited from Russia to the United States. And like Assange, Snowden has been charged under the Espionage Act classic political acts for which they stand charged. Now, there are some other important instruments that you should be aware of. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which is part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, treaty shall be the supreme law of the land, includes a provision called non-refoulement. And that means it forbids the extradition of a person to a country where there are substantial grounds to believe he would be in danger of being tortured. Now, given the fact that Chelsea Manning was tortured by being kept in solitary confinement for 9 months, there is a good chance that Assange could also be tortured. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the torture of Julian Assange in prison in the UK. But there is a reasonable suspicion that he could face torture if he were extradited to the United States. Also, a country has an obligation to refuse extradition when it would violate fundamental rights, and the right to be free from torture and cruel treatment is a fundamental right. Finally, the Johannesburg Principles of National Security, Freedom of Expression, and Access to Information, which were enshrined in 1996, provide no person may be punished on national security grounds for disclosure of information in the public interest in knowing the information outweighs the harm from the disclosure. Now, after the hearing, the extradition hearing, if that goes against Julian Assange, it could be appealed through the British courts and even to the European Court of Human Rights. And despite Britain's Brexit vote, the UK government has agreed to remain under that court's jurisdiction, at least for the time being. Even if Julian Assange is brought to the United States, he could try making many of the same arguments in U.S. courts about it being a political offense, etc. However, he would not likely find a sympathetic reception because he has been so vilified in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, in a moment we'll have another video from Robert Corsini, and he'll show an interview with Daniel Ellsberg and Noam Chomsky discussing Mr. Assange's prison conditions, at which point we'll also have Professor Cohen come back to be commenting on those conditions as well.
What is it about the current situation with Julian right now, where he's facing extradition from the UK to the United States coming up in February? Could you frame that?
Assange's current situation, according to the few people who've been able to see him, is severe deterioration, physical, cognitive, the result of extremely harsh, brutal punishment. And in fact, people have seen him say his life may be in danger from these harsh, brutal conditions. His crime, technically, is not paying bail. Okay, so you pay $50, maybe you spend a night in jail. For this crime, he's been placed in a high-security prison. This is after all he's endured already, and treated like one of the world's dangerous terrorists, and meanwhile facing the constant threat of extradition to the United States, which can take savage retribution for what was in fact a service to the citizens of the United States. That's a brutal situation to try to endure.
There is a separate issue now of the issue of how he's being held pending extradition or while he waits, and that could be a matter of years. Nils Meltzer, the UN rapporteur for torture, has not only called the conditions under which he's being held in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison where 3 people have died unnecessarily, it would seem, in the last year. Conditions in this prison very, very, very problematic. There is no excuse for him to be in a maximum security prison at all, let alone under conditions of virtual isolation on this, which 60 doctors have now appealed to the British government and to the Australian government, saying that this threatens his life, his mental stability, and his life right now. There's a lot of outrages going on in this world every hour of the day and all around the world, some larger and some smaller. The attempt to prosecute in America Julian Assange as a journalist is one of those outrages, and the effort to have him extradited for that purpose is outrage. But a second separate condition is that the conditions under which he's being held, which threaten his emotional, mental, psychological, and physical health, are a separate outrage that should be ended immediately. Many people have called for him to be, for the extradition processes to be dropped, for him to be freed initially. I certainly support that. That isn't going to happen by any indication. England is as determined to stop this exposure of imperial projects, on many of which it's a collaborator with the U.S. They're as anxious to do that as the American government. And this extradition process problem is going to go on for a long time.
On November 1st, 2019, Niels Meltzer, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, stated, unless the UK urgently changes course and alleviates his inhumane situation, Mr. Assange's continued exposure to arbitrariness and abuse may soon end up costing his life. That was in November. In May of last year, Meltzer reported that Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. He had been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture. And Meltzer wrote, in 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states, democratic, he didn't put democratic in quotes, but I would, ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. The collective persecution of Julian Assange must end here and now. An international group of jurists, including, I'm proud to say, my organization, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, wrote a letter to Boris Johnson in the UK, you all know who he is, protesting the involvement of the UK in long-term severe psychological ill treatment of Assange under the European Court of Human Rights. European Convention on Human Rights. They cited international human rights experts, healthcare professionals, and the UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. Meltzer, all of whom found that Assange has been subjected to arbitrary confinement and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment amounting to torture, and that torture poses a grave risk of significant physical, psychological, neuropsychological harm with life-changing and potentially fatal consequences for Assange. He has suffered from a number of debilitating and painful medical conditions, including excruciating tooth abscesses and a serious injury to his shoulder, both of which remained untreated for several years. He was denied permission by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to leave the Ecuadorian embassy to receive hospital treatment, despite a request from the Ecuadorian embassy to the British government for such access to be provided on medical grounds. And Meltzer explained that the oppressive conditions of isolation involving at least 22 hours per day in a single occupancy cell can amount to torture. Now, this came After 9 years of arbitrary and illegal detention in the embassy, the harsh and disproportionate conditions under which he was held have caused further grave injury to his health, and an international group of doctors has expressed serious concern for his present and future safety and well-being. He stated that Assange has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to persistent and progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The cumulative effects can only be described as psychological torture, and some of those symptoms are extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. Julian Assange's father, Mr. John Shipton, reported that his son had further been subjected to physical torture by being put in a hot box. And there's an open letter from legal practitioners and academics to the UK Home Secretary and Shadow Home Secretary. I'm not sure what the Shadow Home Secretary does, but he kind of stays in the shadows for when the Home Secretary. And they remind the UK that they have a duty to protect Assange's right to life under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, and also that there is a prohibition of torture, not just under the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, but also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the European Convention on Human Rights. Thank you.
Can we have a really warm round of applause for the,